let me introduce you. I have Jenny Wei. You are a philosopher and researcher and scholar. I read one of your interesting paper. That was my main interest of introducing you to our podcast because I was reading your paper that castration in the old time and why people castrated. And when I realized actually that castration cult is not just an isolated phenomenon, it was happening across all culture. Then I felt interested because castration is like a symbol of sexuality, and everybody says sexuality is pretty important, like Freudian psychology, then health and disease, modern psychology, industry, media, television, Hollywood, everywhere. Sex is everywhere.
Yeah.
So then forsaking sex by castration, that is also important. How come? So I want to make the connection. And so why not you introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience, then we start.
Okay. Thank you. I'm a transpersonal psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I mainly do focus on research, as you said, and I've been working in this field for a very long time as a professor at the California Institute of Integrative Studies, and prior to that at the what is now Sophia University, but used to be the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Both of those are in California. And I use a lot of my research, not the castration research, in work in organizations. I'm also an organization and leadership development consultant, and a lot of my first research was on the structuring of consciousness. So it doesn't have much to do directly with castration, the castrated gods, or their castration cults. That was sort of a later interest of mine. So that's generally my background. I've had real world corporate jobs for a very long time, but I also work in the academic field in fairly esoteric areas of human consciousness, both altered states and normal states of awareness.
Okay. So I think you are also a public speaker and educator. You do some seminars and education for some few people who are interested in your work, something like that, right?
Yes. And I've spoken a lot at popular fields. I've given a lot of different media presentations on the internet as well as television and radio. Popular audiences like with Dr. Oz or uh, Deepak Chopra.
Chopra,
Yeah, and various places. So you can find me on the internet if you look hard enough.
yeah, exactly. By your name, if you search in YouTube, a couple of interesting video accounts. Actually, I saw a couple of those, and that got me more interested. Why not? Yeah, exactly. Because these kind of topics, many people even don't understand is important. Because they think, oh, it's just a fringe phenomenon. It's not important in my life. And whoever is looking into these topics like esoteric science, esoteric philosophy, religion, occult religion, magic, plus modern psychology, even science, parapsychology, consciousness study, these are for common people. They don't understand this might be important, like a link between all the hidden thing that doesn't make any sense. But you are explicitly studying those, especially the role of sexuality and well-being, right? And
Yes.
consciousness, exactly. Okay, so very interesting. And in our podcast, actually, we never spoke about sex because sex itself is a controversial topic, and many people think, oh, what's to talk about? It's like food. Everybody does it. Everybody likes it. End of story. So why not you like lay the foundation of your like work? Why sex and sexuality is important in our life in general?
Well, I think it's important for some of the reasons you just said. It's like food, it's like sleep. We may not think very much about it or think it worthy of a lot of comment or serious study, but without those things, we die. And it doesn't mean that as an individual, I have to have sex, but if enough people don't have sex, then our species is going to collapse. So it's important from a basic survival level. And my first studies actually involved altered states that are triggered by sexual activity. I was more interested in the altered states and their ability to transform people very dramatically. So that was what I was initially studying. And then over time, I just happened to do this study, this historical study about castration and castration cults. But sex is such a driver for people in, after puberty and for at least 3 or 4 decades. It influences so much of people's behavior, even if they've gotten married and they say, "Oh, I'm not available for other people. I'm sexually uh, content or sexually stable." It's still a major influencer of all kinds of behavior, whether people are aware of it or not. And in discovering that without studying particular sexual techniques, sex has been it's had a troubled relationship with spirituality for many, many years, but there are spiritual paths like Tantra and like Daoist sex in the Chinese tradition that are based on using sex to produce certain kinds of altered states and to produce paths of spiritual progress. You can achieve high levels of spiritual attainment through sex in some of these paths. And there's also a Western esoteric sexual path that has more to do with magic and having power over people than with attaining high levels of spiritual uh, uh, sublimity. But it's enough, there are enough indications that sex is associated with all kinds of altered states that are very similar to the altered states that are attained through non-sexual spiritual practices like meditation, like trance dancing, like chanting, various other practices. And so that was the thing that got me interested in it initially. And my interest was sparked when I had an experience like that myself, when I was having sex with a partner and suddenly I wasn't in the room having sex anymore. I seemed to be hallucinating being in another place, even though I was aware that, yes, I was really in a particular room with a particular partner. And what I was seeing was not real in one sense, but I couldn't get the images to stop. I continued to see them, I continued to experience them. And it was really wild. I had never known anything like that existed. So I thought I was going crazy. And I never said anything about it to my partner. But after a few weeks or months, I had a different kind of experience. I had an experience of non duality or samadhi, satori, whatever you want to call it, during sex. And it was such a vast experience. I couldn't hide or conceal that I was having it. And in fact, I started laughing ultimately because it was just such a strange experience. And when I began speaking about it to my partner, he said that he had also had a whole series of altered states with me, and he'd never spoken of them either because he thought I would think he was crazy. So we began talking about this, and I started looking it up in the literature that I know on altered states, and I found out that, sure enough, other people had referenced sex as triggering altered states, but nobody had really done an in-depth study on it. Nobody had tried to see what was involved, what kinds of states were produced. And so that set me off on a path of research that lasted for several years while I gathered enough data for study.
So when you had the experience, uh, how, like, you were mature adult at that time, or your early teens, or
Yes.
late teens?
No, I was a mature adult. I was in my 50s, and my partner was in his late 60s.
Mhm. Okay,
And
because
I had never
you
had anything like that before. So it was completely unprecedented for me and for him as well. He had never had that experience with another
because the reason I was thinking, because when you are very young, like 20 years old, when you have sex, especially in the first time, maybe first couple of years, you are overwhelmed by the experience. You cannot think anything. You just go with the flow.
partner. Hmm.
But as you mature, so you start to notice that many other things are going on simultaneously. So maybe that's why in the later part you realize, oh, sex is not just the sex itself, it's something else. Something else is going on. So probably that definitely helps for the mature people to understand sex has many layers, right? Right?
It could be. I'm trying to remember now the youngest person in my sample. I had people in my sample who were in their 20s who had had unusual experiences, and the oldest one, I think, was, if I remember correctly, was in his 70s. And so it did cover a wide range, but I think you're correct in saying more of the people tended to be older.
Little bit mature, not necessarily older, maybe 40, 45.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a good age, because by that time you have enough experience to eliminate the noise and focus what is important.
Mhm.
Something like that. Something like that. Okay, so you mentioned several times altered state of consciousness. So it's a very vague term if somebody don't understand what you're talking about. Can you describe a little bit what you mean by altered state of consciousness and its connection with the sex that you had?
Yes. Um, well, a normal state of consciousness, or what anybody considers normal, is culturally determined. What is typical for Americans as a normal state of consciousness is different from that of, say, an indigenous American. I happen to live in New Mexico, so it would be different from maybe some of the Navajos or Pueblo people who live around me. So it's culturally determined, but for any culture, a normal adult waking consciousness is considered to operate in a particular way. And the parameters that we measure are people's experience of time, their experience of space, and their experience of agency. What kinds of things are animate and can have an influence on the environment. So if, for instance, you're in a serious accident and you've had sustained some kind of a head injury, if you go to a hospital, one of the first things they will do is try to determine if you're oriented or if your consciousness is functioning normally. So they'll usually ask you if you know what day it is, or another way in our country of finding out if you're oriented in time is to say, who's the president? So they'll ask you questions like that. They'll say, do you know where you are? You know, do you think you're in the hospital, or are you aware of your surroundings? And then the doctor and the nurse will hold up a hand and say, you know, how many fingers am I holding up? Well, this is where you get into agency. You have to understand that it's the doctor or the nurse holding up the fingers. It's not, you're not holding up the fingers, it's someone else. And you have to be able to count them. So those things are called the three spheres of reality in clinical psychology. And if you answer according to what your culture says is normal, we all agree that this is Tuesday, for example, and it's nighttime, it's not daytime, then you're oriented and you're in a normal state of consciousness. If you experience something differently, if, for instance, I say, well, there's a ghost here in the room, you know, it's my dead father, and I can see him standing over there. In American culture, mainstream American culture, we don't believe in ghosts. So people would say, you're hallucinating. There's something wrong with your consciousness, with your mentation. Now, ghosts are very common in some cultures, and if I said I saw a ghost, that culture, I'd have normal consciousness. But in our culture, that would be I would be altered, because I would be seeing something that people in my culture would agree could not really be there. So in an altered state, one or all of those three spheres of reality are different from what most adults would perceive.
Mhm. Okay, okay. And even though it's different, and you're still functional. That means you understand that I'm experiencing something different, but I'm not disoriented. You self-check yourself to check if I'm just hallucinating versus this experience I'm having is real, something like that, right? So how do you
Yeah.
how distinguish between your genuine spiritual or altered level of awareness versus you're just mistaken, like you're something wrong? So how do you
Well,
get?
it happens on a continuum,
Mhm,
because I could say that I see a ghost, let's say over there in the corner of my office here, but I would be aware that here I'm sitting here in my office and I'm just seeing a visual, uh,
mhm,
you know, change that other people can't perceive. But I could be in such an altered state that I wouldn't even realize I was here in my office. I might not realize, what time of day it was.
mhm,
And this happens with people who are in extreme altered states. They are maybe having visual and auditory hallucinations. They may not be aware of the passage of time. Time can be very plastic in certain altered states, where a moment seems like it lasts forever, or lots of things seem to be happening very, very fast and all at the same time. People, for instance, who experience past lives, um, perceive that they're a different person. So they have a different sense of agency and personality. They may perceive themselves to be in a different time and in a different place. And that's all happening at once. So it can happen on a continuum where you're more or less oriented to the here and now,
mhm.
or you've completely lost the here and now, and you're completely, we might say, out of it in English. You're just not tracking what other people are tracking at all.
Yeah. When I was doing my graduate work uh, regarding this altered state of awareness, I had an argument with my professor. So my professor doesn't believe at all. He's a neuroscientist. I was doing my neuroscience PhD. So he doesn't believe in at all this extrasensory perception or spirit or anything not physical. So then by the same extension, he was trying to tell me that all this religious experience, they're just nonsense, because it's just your altered level of awareness of something real, but you are perceiving something differently, so you're just mistaken. Then I told him one thing actually that hit him really hard, because I came from Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, India, there are a lot of, I am originally from Bangladesh. There are a lot of spiritual people. We grew up in a spiritual environment. Here, we in America, we grow up in materialistic environment. So it's different. So then I told him the problem is when you respect somebody with your whole life, that person is really always right. When you respect somebody, that his judgment is never clouded, and he tells you that this is real, then actually you are in trouble, because then you have to weigh your judgment versus his judgment. And in your entire life, you never saw say something wrong. And if he says something down the road, you realize, oh, he was right. He was always right. So problem is, some wise men always mention this thing is real, but we commoner argue with each other because this is not real. So just by tradition and by witness and by historical anecdotes, you cannot just eliminate that this is not real. Maybe your judgment is not that far to perceive those things. That's why you're just denying all these things. So as a scientist, as a materialist point of view, I have to still argue with you, but doesn't mean that I don't believe you. I still believe you, but sometimes I'll throw some question that will say, oh, It doesn't believe those things. I respect all tradition, including spirituality, and especially those personal experience, because experience is very subtle thing, and the person who is experiencing, uh, they cherish that experience so hard they can bet their life with it.
Mhm.
Exactly. So that makes a big difference. Common people, they will argue, but they cannot bet their life that if I'm wrong, I'm willing to die. That people, the common people will not bet. But those persons who really had experience, they are so convinced, they will say, if I'm wrong, I can go to jail. You can, I don't care because I'm damn sure I'm right.
Mhm.
So those are important input people has to take before rejecting any such claim that real spiritual experience can happen with a sexual trigger.
Yes.
Exactly. So now tell us a little bit that how your experience got triggered and what was the experience. Little bit more elaboration.
Uh, well, the first experience that I had, I don't know how it got triggered. I was in a room that was just had white walls. It was just like a square box, you know. And instead of seeing those white walls, my visual field completely changed. And I seemed to be in a round tower where the walls were painted pink with a Greek key design. It's a geometric design that went around in a border near the top of this tower that I seemed to be in. And the Greek key was square, it had angles, but then it became curvilinear. And I wondered when it became curvilinear whether somehow the orgasmic rhythm that I was in I was having some sort of synesthesia, you know, and that I was perceiving uh, waves that, you know, coincided with orgasmic waves. But quickly, the vision changed, and instead of being in this pink painted tower, I seemed to be out on the beach. I couldn't perceive or feel my body, but I was looking out from a sandy beach out into the ocean and seeing sun sparkling on the water, seeing waves come in.
Mhm.
And that only registered for a moment before it seemed like I was down under the waves, under the water, and looking at coral and sea creatures all around me. And as I looked at them, they went from being realistic to resembling the way sea creatures are painted on the island of Crete, in ancient Crete, and particularly at the Palace of Knossos. And I have no idea why any of that imagery came up. It lasted, I don't know how long, and then it disappeared, and I was just back in the white room again, with my lover having sex. And I don't know how it came. I don't know why or when, what caused it to go away.
Mhm.
But the second experience I had was just an immediate experience of non-duality. Everything absolutely disappeared in a white wash of light, and then I could perceive everything in the room again, but my relationship to all of it had changed. You know, it was non-dual. There were no categories, there was no time, there wasn't any self that was doing the perceiving. It was complete state of non-duality. And I had read about non-duality, I'd studied non-duality, but I had never had a direct experience of that. But I recognized it as soon as it happened, and it was so completely it was like and unlike anything I had imagined it could be,
Mhm.
that I just started laughing. It seemed like some huge cosmic joke that I would have this enlightenment experience while I was having sex. I
Mhm.
wasn't even trying to bring it about with meditation or any other practices. Um, so that was the second experience, and entirely different from the first one.
Mhm. If you just like try to see the correspondence between our normal day-to-day experience, sensory experience. Then if you rank that, what are the experience you, like, people uh, perceive as a more precious or more powerful. So obviously, number one, pleasure, usual pleasure in games, running, doing some good thing that gives you pleasure. So that's number one. Food, if you're really hungry, food gives you pleasure for sure. Then obviously sex, because if you never had a sexual experience and for the first time you wanted to unite with somebody and you have a like non-traumatic beautiful experience, then you realize, oh my god, so it was one of the most powerful experience. Then serving others, doing some philanthropy also gives you pleasure. But if you calculate the intensity, that the amount of time you spent and each unit of time, how much pleasure you are getting, I would say food and sex is the most concentrated, more potent pleasure that human can experience. And now, among the food and the sex, the problem is food you do 3 times a day and you do it public. There's no restriction, there's no shame, and there's no cultural taboo, all kinds of things, right? Food, as long as you eat conventional food, there are plenty of access. So there's no restriction of accessibility. So the pleasure from the food gets blunted. The only thing remains potent as of today, even all this media and availability of more partners, but still getting partners, right partner is still hard, because you can get partner, but your soulmate is hard, like the person you identified with. So at the end of the day, among all physical experience, orgasm still remains the top, in my common sense argument. So now you tell me why that intense pleasure experience also triggers a non-duality kind of experience. What's the link? Why?
I don't know what the link is, and because the range of altered states that can be triggered by sex is vast. Not everybody has a non-dual experience, but they still have extremely intense experiences that can be life-altering. And just to address a couple of the things that you said, the people in my sample, although some of them were with a partner that they considered their soulmate, many were not. Sometimes some people had these experiences during casual, transient sexual encounters with strangers, which led me to believe that maybe part of what causes it is abandonment, the ability to just be completely abandoned during sex, which could happen with a highly trusted partner. You don't have to worry about how you're performing or how you look or how you sound or anything. And that's true of a casual sexual pickup. You don't care what they think. You're not going to see them again the next day. So I think the ability to be uninhibited in your sexual behavior may be a factor that plays into it for some people. But it's not as though highly skilled sex is going to bring about a particular kind of experience or a particular love relationship. The circumstances under which people had these experiences were extremely varied. It didn't matter whether people were orgasmic, for example. Some people had these experiences just holding hands with somebody they were very sexually attracted to. There was no orgasm involved. Some people didn't like to have an orgasm during these experiences because it detracted from the altered state that was being supported by their sexual behavior. And men particularly said that as soon as they had an orgasm, the experience died. So they didn't want to have an orgasm during sex. So it wasn't related to orgasm. It wasn't related to the mechanics of sex. People who were having heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, kinky sex, ordinary sex, it didn't matter what they were doing physically, they could still have these experiences. And as I said, the nature of the relationship didn't matter, whether it was true love or just a casual pickup. That didn't seem to be part of it either. So none of the things that I imagined might be contributors to these experiences turned out to be true. They just weren't.
Yeah, it's interesting because if it is not directly connected with orgasm itself, then this coupling of sex and some experience might be symbolic rather than biologic. Because most of the neuroscientists, what they try to do, they would say, oh, during height of orgasm, your brain releases dopamine. That dopamine activates some group of neuron. You go into altered level of awareness. That thing will not go, whatever you just said, because the orgasm, biological orgasm, might not be directly linked with the experience that you have, because you just mentioned that some male doesn't want to have the orgasm because it will die off, so they want to hold off, right? So that means the biological part might be a distraction. So
yes, that's true.
if that is, for arguments of sake, if we agree on that, that actually signifies that sex might be a symbolic route for the experience is the main target. Sex is just the middle ground you have to go through, but it's not the ultimate target. The orgasm itself is not the ultimate target. Rather, the union, the feelings of non-duality versus other kind of experience, that is might be the goal of this kind of relationship between male and female or whatever partner you're talking about.
I think that's possible. One thing to consider, though, is that a lot of the physiological behavior involved in sex resembles or is similar to physiological behavior people on spiritual paths engage in to attain some of these states. Chanting, for instance, chanting prayers, chanting a mantra, whatever you're chanting, it's repetitive sound. It begins to have a rhythm of its own. And people in sex are making sounds, often to a particular rhythm. They're engaging in rhythmic movement, the way people who are doing trance dancing engage in. They are relaxed and yet alert, and often have a relaxed, alert focus on whatever stimulation they are receiving. So they have, an open mind, but also a focused mind that can be very, very narrowly focused, like a lot of different meditation forms. And so sex has a lot of the physiological components that certain spiritual techniques do to bring about particular kinds of altered states. And I think those may contribute. And for the neurological thing, can build up over time if you're having sex for an extended period, which is certainly happens in Daoist sex, tantric sex, and lesbian sex, for example, very, very long on foreplay. When those things happen, the kinds of brain chemistry that you were talking about, serotonin and other dopamine, a lot of other neurological changes begin to happen. And so that builds up whether you're having an orgasm or not. And there's some reason to believe that some of these brain chemistry changes can affect these altered states, that begin to happen. And it, makes sense. Physiologically, it's the same as a lot of other spiritual practices, can produce.
Okay, fair enough. I think they have similarity, but there's no one-to-one correlation. They helps each other. Plus, they might not be entirely dependent, rather intermingle and it gives pleasure. It also serves other purpose simultaneously, something like that. That's understandable. Now, let's switch gear because we have so many interesting things. We are still in the introduction, right? So we had so many things to talk about. So I think let's switch gear to our sex and sacred. That that idea that sexuality today and sexuality in old time, and how the religious idea intermingle with sex itself.